I rise to speak at second reading on Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, which is currently before the Senate Committee on Transport and Communications. About 30 witnesses have already been heard. From the outset, I must say that I have rarely seen a bill that arouses so much passion and so many differences of opinion. On the one hand, many representatives of the cultural sector are urging us to adopt the bill as is, or to strengthen it. On the other hand, as my colleagues stated, our email boxes are full of circular letters from citizens who fear for their freedom of expression and for their freedom to listen and watch what they want on the internet. I, for one, do not believe that the rights and freedoms of Canadians are threatened by this bill. I do recognize, however, that in a polarized social and political context, where some people are quick to demonize their opponents and distort their words to whip up support, certain words have become radioactive. The word algorithm, in particular. There are concerns about some parts of the legislation and the regulations to follow. The more I hear from stakeholders about C-11, the more I realize that there are several intertwined debates. Unlike some of the simpler bills, it is not simply a matter of one side for and one side against. At its core, Bill C-11 is an exercise in adjusting. It is about adjusting Canadian broadcasting policy to the new technological context. In the past, music and audiovisual programs were broadcast by traditional radio and television stations, which held licenses and were subject to several rules, including quotas. The Government of Canada was thus able to ensure that it supported our artists and showcased the country's cultural diversity. Today, we know that a significant proportion of Canadians consume music and programs on online platforms, often foreign, that are not subject to any regulation. Last year, for the first time in Quebec, subscriptions to online platforms surpassed traditional cable television services. 71% of Quebec adults subscribed to paid online viewing services. That is a lot. The same trend can be observed in recorded music, which is rapidly shifting to streaming platforms, where only 8% of the music listened to by Quebecers is francophone, only 8%. As a result, of course, is that our artists are losing visibility, and the government no longer has the means to promote Canadian culture and content, including French language, Indigenous, and other minority content. In the Wild West that is digital platforms, the biggest players dictate the rules of the game. And as we know, the biggest players are American companies. Faced with this new reality, two approaches are possible. The first is to let it go and pretend that in the internet age there is no role for government. Then the government could no longer regulate or control anything. The regulatory framework would be allowed to die a slow death as the public moved to digital platforms. Ultimately, within a few years, the programming and music consumed by Canadians would be determined solely by the market. The problem with this approach is that it abandons the defense of Canada's cultural identity values in favor of the web giants. YouTube and TikTok came before the committee yesterday to reaffirm that the business model that has made them successful is just fine. Their message is simple. What they call their magic sauce works, and the proof is in the pudding. Canadian YouTubers and singers are successful. Beyond these generalities, however, we have received very little information. What percentage of listening do these Canadian artists obtain? How is that distributed by artist, by type of content, and across the country? YouTube doesn't have any specific statistics to give us. So, actually, YouTube really does not care where creators come from because we are in a global world. But the survival of Quebec and Francophone culture cannot depend on one or two successful artists like Charlotte Cardin or Cœur de Pirate, whose names we have heard over and over again. We must be able to discover and hear others. The second option, the one proposed by C-11, is a compromise. It consists of integrating the new platforms into the Canadian regulatory framework, but in a different way from traditional broadcasters. The platforms will have to contribute financially to the production of Canadian content. They will be required to and they will have to showcase Canadian content, but they will continue to offer Canadian audiences rich and diverse pay-per-view programming. The CRTC will have the complex task of adapting the rules to each foreign player. And I'm saying each foreign player, that's the promise. That would be a titanic undertaking. And the CRTC, I fear, would be overwhelmed. I personally support the main thrust of Bill C-11. Canadians will retain the best of digital platform, that is, the freedom to listen and watch what they want, based on their preferences, while giving our artists a chance to find their place and their audience in this new broadcasting ecosystem. But as is often the case, the devil is in the details. As such, there are a few central issues. The bill delegates a great deal of authority to the CRTC to set the rules for online platforms and to implement Canadian broadcasting and cultural policy. It would have been better if the government had issued its directives to the CRTC now already. Currently, we feel like we are being asked to sign a blank check. Among the fundamental questions the CRTC will have to address is the central issue of Canadian content. How should it be defined today? Should certain criteria be given precedence over others? Should we focus on the subject matter, on the artist, or on the intellectual property in the works? It will be up to the CRTC to review this crucial definition. The issue of discoverability has meant that a lot has been written about it, and that much bandwidth has been referred to it. This text of the law refers twice to the notion of discoverability, but does not provide further details. How will Canadian content be discovered on digital platforms? Is it enough to promote it without affecting the algorithms? What would be the difference between effective listening requirements and the quotas of the traditional system? Many questions remain on this subject. For example, during our brief hearings in June, I asked the chair of the CRTC how he was going to ensure the discoverability of Canadian content without intervening in the algorithms. His response was that the platforms themselves would have to change their algorithms to achieve the desired results. That means that Canadian users would get more Canadian content. This response shocked those following the hearings, as my colleague said. For them, it was evident that the algorithms will have to be changed, even though the bill states that the CRTC does not have that power. Under C-11, the CRTC is not authorized to force anyone to use any kind of algorithms. Specifically on that, I think the debate is so polarized that it's hard to see the big picture. For example, YouTube and TikTok say that without having touched their algorithms, they already put a lot of effort into promoting Canadian creators. Whether it's revenue sharing or grants or others, they brag about their efforts and the success of some Canadian artists. So why are they worried about C-11? Since they'll have a choice of how to get results in terms of Canadian viewing. Could it be because only algorithms really have the power to influence the habits of users of these platforms? The logic of the algorithms is simple. The clients are offered only content that is similar to what they've already heard in order to keep them listening. But in a predominantly English-speaking North American universe, how can we expect minority cultural content, whether French or Indigenous, be spontaneously recommended? How can we believe that mathematical algorithms will be interested in the exception rather than the rule? Another distinction applies. For artists from English Canada, the playing field is global. For French-speaking Quebec artists, however, the primary market is Quebec. These artists are creating their content in a beautiful but minority language. By declaring algorithms off limits as favored by the platforms, are we giving in on the main issue and abandoning Canadian culture and artists to the steamroller of the American giants. But by interfering in the algorithms, we risk harming the lesser-known artists we want to support, because they could be sent further down the lists of recommendations if the client says no. It's a huge paradox. Personally, I believe that the foreign players on our market have a responsibility to find innovative solutions so that we see ourselves represented in this tide of global content. I understand this isn't what they are trying to do, that they don't want to use any users. But we have to remember that Canadian users are subject to much more regulations in terms of Canadian content. We also have to be aware that we can't base our approach on what other countries are doing. This aspect of the bill, that is the idea of requiring platforms like Spotify and YouTube and others to showcase Canadian works, is a first. It's never been done elsewhere. Many other countries are thinking about it, but Canada is the first to try to regulate it. We are feeling our way through the darkness. Another issue that has caused a lot of debate is social media, especially YouTube, which offers both user-uploaded content and commercial content. I think there is room for further clarification in the legislation as to what defines commercial content in order to reassure content creators. Of course, even though Bill C-11 aims to enhance Canadian culture and artistic expression, it also has several economic dimensions. On this subject, the debates have been fed by many Canadian organizations, producers, broadcasters, unions. Among the many requests to amend the bill, one finds a mixture of corporate, protectionist, and other interests. For example, independent producers want to keep the advantage they've had over the past 30 years. Thanks to the Broadcasting Act, that means that they are called upon in priority. Now, broadcasters would like their own producing companies to be treated as independents. In these cases, it's not necessarily promoting just Canadian content, but to favor certain players and change the balance of power. These disputes between Canadian players prevent the creation of a common front. Beyond these more specific issues, Bill C-11 also brings divergent political, cultural, and economic visions to the fore. I'm looking at my colleague, Senator Houssakos, who's here. In the new global cultural market, where Canada's creators have access to, but also compete with, the world, should we seek to protect our creators or simply help them stand out? Is it possible to give our creators a chance without unduly constraining the choices and preferences of the Canadian public? I do not have all the answers, of course. And while I agree that Canada seeks to protect its cultural sovereignty, including Francophone culture, my duty is to assess whether and how this bill can be improved. Personally, I remain convinced that culture is not a commodity like any other, and that it deserves significant support from the state, particularly when it is a minority culture such as French in North America. I'm extremely concerned about the underlying trends in Quebec, particularly in terms of music listening. We cannot surrender our cultural sovereignty and national identity to algorithms and market forces. That would be a form of cultural suicide in the medium term, resulting from a willful blindness to the imbalance of forces at play. In this sense, I believe that Bill C-11 has a legitimate political objective.
Having said that, compromises and modern solutions must be found that also respond to the desire of Canadians and Quebecers to take part in and consume cultural products from around the world without unduly limiting their choices. The defense and promotion of our distinct identity is more legitimate and topical than ever, but we cannot expect a return to the past, to a time when the availability of cultural content was strictly controlled. Our challenge is therefore to find the right balance. Thank you.